This is the MiniBrute 2S. But there's nothing mini about it. Take a listen and I'll walk you through everything that's special and new about it. Even though it's called the MiniBrute 2S, there's almost no point in comparing it to the first MiniBrute because Arpeggiator has improved on so many aspects of it. Let's dive right in. So this is the MiniBrute 2S. I won't compare it to the MiniBrute 2. There will be a separate video about that. I'll just talk about it as a standalone synth. And as such, there are two main features that make it special. The first is the patch bay, and the second is this amazingly advanced sequencer. There are a few other gems scattered throughout, but let's continue with the basic overview. There are two oscillators, one complex one and a simpler one. You can use it as a sub-oscillator or tune it separately, and it also has an LFO mode. While we're on the topic of LFOs, there are two official ones, but there are more hiding throughout. There's one here, of course, and in the sequencer, there are two extra ones. We'll talk about them later. Beside that, there are two envelopes, an ADSR envelope and an AD envelope with switches for sustain and looping. Finally, there are the filter and amp sections. There's a Steiner Parker 12 dB per octave filter, which is multi-mode. There's the brute factor, of course. So that's the basic overview. Let's start diving into the details. So let's first talk about the big elephant in the room, the enormous patch bay. Now, the MiniBrute is a semi-modular synth, so it's designed to make sounds without anything plugged into the patch bay. The way it's wired up by default is written in blue next to each relevant knob, and that also correlates to labels on the patch bay. So, for example, the ADSR envelope, as you can tell by the blue writing here, is hooked up to modulate the filter cutoff point. So as I press a note, you can see that these pads are triggering the envelope, the ADSR envelope, which is moving the cutoff point. All four sliders controlling the cutoff point. Now, if I don't like this connection, I can change it. So for example, what if I wanted the ADSR envelope to control my amplitude? What if I didn't want the AD envelope to do it? So all I need to do is locate the out point of the ADSR and bypass the AD control by hooking the ADSR into the amp. Now I've just rewired how the synth works. Let's check to see that we're in full control. So let's get sustain up, change the attack. Add some release maybe. Now, we're still controlling the filter. If we wanted to disconnect the ADSR envelope from the filter, there's an easy way to do that. Locate the input point for FM, filter FM, plug a cable into it, just any dummy cable, doesn't have to be connected to anything. And now we are no longer controlling the filter with the ADSR envelope. So that's how you use the patch bay, and you can also patch in and out with external gear as well, of course. The outputs on the patch bay are marked with dark text over a white background, and there are 20 of those, and the inputs are regular white text on a dark background, and there are 28 of those inputs. As with the knobs, the blue labels will tell you what is pre-configured by default to the inputs. Okay, let's talk about the oscillator section of the MiniBrute 2S. Oscillator 1 has a few features that you don't find in every synth. The first is that you can mix the different waveforms. So this is a saw, and I can gradually bring in a pulse, and you'll notice as I change the pulse width, the two waves are intertwined and create a brand new waveform. Unlike other synths that sometimes force you to switch between waveforms, here you have complete control over mixing the different types of waveforms. Next, each of the different waveforms has its own little modifier. So for saw, it's the ultra saw, which mixes in two other shapes, and that can be modulated by LFO2, both in frequency and in shape. That's SAW. The pulse wave or square waveform can also, besides being shaped this way, be modulated, and that is by default automatically hooked into LFO1. And the triangle wave, typically simple, has a few surprises up its sleeve. The first is the metalizer, which is a wave folding knob, but by default it's modulated by the velocity with which you hit a key. Now I think that can be made more interesting, so I'll go to the patch bay, go to LFO out, plug that to metal mod in, and now I've got LFO1 affecting the metalizer. And the depth is controllable with this knob. Now the metalizer has one more trick up its sleeve, and that is that it can accept through this input any wave shape, not just the triangle. So I'm going to take oscillator 2, make it into a simple sine wave. And by the way, this is oscillator 2, so nice to meet you. Anyway, simple sine wave for now. And what I'll do is I'll take its output in the patch bay and plug that into the metalizer input. And now, once it's plugged in, we don't hear the effect yet because I need to lower oscillator 2 and bring up the triangle wave, which is no longer a triangle wave. And now the sine wave can be metalized as well and modulated, and you can now metalize any audio source you like. Let's look at a few more features of oscillator 1. There's glide, which is fairly straightforward, and you can fine-tune more than an octave up and down. And FM is the last nice feature of oscillator 1. By default, oscillator 2 is the modulation source. This knob controls the modulation depth, and you get different sounds depending on the waveform that you're modulating. Now, FM synthesis is a whole topic unto itself. You can set modulation depth with this knob and modulation frequency with this one, assuming that's the way that it's patched, of course. Now, by default, the FM is exponential, but through the patch bay, you've got access to linear FM as well. And as you'll hear, linear FM sounds very different. Okay, let's talk about oscillator 2. Oscillator 2 has 3 different shapes: sine, saw, and square. It also has 3 tuning modes. Fine is for when you want to use it, say, as a sub-oscillator, or a fourth or a fifth, above or below. Really any tuning you like. The all setting will let you choose any frequency for the oscillator. Of course, you can modulate this as well. And then LFO will turn it into an LFO. You're not really supposed to hear this usually. It's about affecting other parameters. The noise oscillator rounds out the oscillator section. And you can also accept external inputs and apply filtering and envelopes to that as well. Another interesting oscillator feature is sync, and you need to use the patch bay for that. So I will take oscillator 2, plug that into the sync input for oscillator 1. And even though the volume for oscillator 2 is down, it still affects oscillator 1. What oscillator sync does is force oscillator 1 to restart every time oscillator 2 restarts. This results in this hard sync effect, and then you can modulate oscillator 1 to create sounds with the hard sync effect. All right, let's talk about LFOs. We'll start with the two main LFOs. I'll plug LFO 2 into pitch just because that's the easiest way to hear what it does. LFOs, or low frequency oscillators, have different shapes and rates by which they modulate parameters. Beside the two main LFOs, you've got VCO2 that can be an LFO, the AD envelope, the sequencer, and patch bay create two tracks that are LFO tracks as well, and we'll cover that later. Let's talk about the filter section, because there are a few interesting innovations there as well. So filters, if you're not familiar with them, let frequencies in or out depending on the type of the filter. They do that around a configurable cutoff point. The easiest way to visually see what they do is with a noise oscillator. And if you check out the spectrum analyzer here, a low-pass filter cuts out the high frequencies. Bandpass cuts out frequencies both above and below the cutoff point. A high-pass filter will filter out the low frequencies. And a notch filter, which is very subtle here, will drop frequencies at the cutoff point and leave everything else in. All the filter modes allow you to add resonance, which is an emphasis at the cutoff point. This makes the least sense for a notch filter, but for the others has a really nice effect of emphasizing sounds at the cutoff point. Now the point is not just to make wind sounds, obviously. Most sounds except sine waves have harmonics, and filters help play with those harmonics, both by emphasizing and de-emphasizing them. So let's check out the ways that you can affect the filter. The built-in configuration is the ADSR envelope through this knob, which is bipolar, which means you can affect the filter cutoff movement either positively or negatively. And that creates a really nice and completely different effect. Another really nice new feature is resonance modulation. So through this knob here, and whatever modulator, LFO1 in this case, is connected to it, you can impact the resonance, which is a really nice new sound design tool at your fingertips. Okay, to round out the filter section, there's one more input and knob that lets you control the filter cutoff point. So this knob is an attenuator that by default is connected to pad pressure. Now, what's special about it is that you can use it also as an attenuator for anything else through the patch bay by wiring a modulator through here. For example, I want to have LFO2 control the pitch of VCO2, but the problem with both LFO1 and LFO2 is that they don't have built-in attenuators. They just go through the extremes, as you can hear, back and forth between the highest voltage and the lowest voltage. And that's where this comes in. If I route the LFO through the attenuator, and only then bring it back into VCO2, and now you can see how this knob attenuates or opens up LFO2 between the extremes of the modulation. Okay, let's move on to the amp section. It's the next door neighbor to the filter section after all, and it has the brute factor, which is basically a feedback loop that can dramatically change the sounds the synth makes. Also in the amp section, volume control, global tune, and another attenuator. So very similar to attenuator 1, this also has a default routing, which opens up the amp. And if you don't want that, you can disable it by plugging a cable over here that disconnects it from the amp, and there are ports in the patch bay through which you can route whatever you want and attenuate it. Okay, we already talked about ADSR. Let's talk about the AD envelope. Now, the way that this works is pretty simple. There's control over the attack speed and decay speed. This switch determines whether the decay will start only when you leave the pad or leave the note, or whether decay will be triggered immediately after the attack cycle ends, regardless of how long you press a note. So that's how this switch works, very simple. And then this switch lets you turn the AD envelope into an LFO. In loop mode, it just loops. And you can route this envelope to any parameter you want, not just the amp. Before I move on to the sequencer, let's talk about a few more patch bay inputs and outputs. The inverter is, let me explain what that does. So here I've got a saw LFO connected to the pitch of VCO1. What if I wanted that to go up, to ramp up? Well, that's what the inverter is for. If I pass the LFO through the inverter, it will switch it around. Next up, the VCA section will take two inputs and mix them into one output, and CV lets you control the level of that output. The attenuator section is connected to these two knobs. We talked about that. The next section is for syncing clock with external devices. And the MIDI section will output anything coming from the pads or from an external keyboard if you have one connected. You've got pitch and gate, and then two completely configurable channels, which brings us to all the craziness in the sequencer. Overall, you've got 4 or 3 tracks, depending on how you count. You can sequence up to 64 steps and anything in between. There are 16 sequences per bank and 4 banks, A through D. Pitch and gate can be looked at as one track, and then velocity and pressure are 2 additional configurable tracks. There are 2 ways to sequence, step and live. Let's go through step first. Once you've added a step, you can use the knob above the step to configure its parameters. You can configure any length for a pattern with last step. So now I've shortened my pattern to just 4 steps. If I want, I can also copy and paste steps. That works for patterns too. Every step has a secondary parameter, which you can access by hitting Shift and turning the knob. So in case of a pitch step, the parameter is slide. So as we go through the different track types, we'll look at these 2 parameters and see how they control what that track does. Let's go to the next track, which is the gate track. Here the main knob function is gate length, or tie, to tie the notes to each other. That's if I want the notes to play in a sequence. And with the secondary shift function, you can add between 2 to 4 ratchets. I'll slow down the tempo so you can hear it a little bit better. So those are the first 2 tracks, or you can treat them as one because they're tied together. The third track is also tied to the first 2 as long as it's in velocity mode, which you can configure with the knobs as well. Let me show you how that works in the simple mode first. So I'll take the velocity out from the patch bay and connect that to the pitch of VCO1. And then the knobs will configure levels, and with Shift you can configure slides. Track 3 is synced to tracks 1 and 2 as long as it's in velocity mode. Track 4, pressure, same thing. As long as it's in pressure mode, it's synced to tracks 1 and 2, and it's basically another output that you can configure levels and slides for. But tracks 3 and 4 can also be disconnected from 1 and 2. Before I show you that, I want to show you a few more ways to sequence. You can sequence live. There's a metronome, Shift record, and you can just play live. Another way to sequence is with the built-in Arpeggiator. There's a shift mode that holds notes for you and lets you add notes one by one. You can choose the Arpeggiator type. It's a nice way to mess around with the knobs hands-free. And once you're happy with a pattern, you can hit Shift record, and the arpeggiated pattern will be recorded onto the sequence, which is very useful. You can set swing, by the way, for any pattern. There's random arpeggiation. I also want to very briefly show you a few sequence playback capabilities. The ARP button has a different function if you are in step sequence mode. You can basically use it to loop subsections of a sequence. Also, I call your attention to the blue letters on the pads. You can play sequences backwards, forwards and backwards, and randomly. You've got the option for tap tempo if you like, and multiple sync options as well. Next up, pattern chaining is really easy and powerful. I've created 3 one-note patterns, D1, D2, and D3. Now mind you, each of these sequences can be up to 64 steps. And chaining them is a simple matter of hitting chain and clicking the order that I want them to play. And you can chain up to 16 sequences, which means an over 1,000 note chain, which is pretty cool. You can also transpose patterns like I showed you in the intro to this video, and you can change scales as well. You can use the MIDI Control Center software, by the way, to create your own user scales if you want to. Okay, now let's talk about some advanced sequencing and using tracks 3 and 4, or velocity and pitch, separately from what's going on tracks 1 and 2. So for this, I'm going to create a simple 4-note pattern. This pattern is going to run using the pitch and gate tracks, tracks 1 and 2. Now I'll take the velocity output and plug it into VCO2. So basically we're going to control oscillator 2 using track 3, the velocity track, and to do that I hit the track and turn the knob, and now I've converted the velocity track to a new pitch track, and I'm going to use that to play paraphonically. Tracks 1 and 2 will control VCO1, and track 3 is going to control VCO2. Just need to get them in tune. And now the notes sequenced here on the velocity track really behave as an independent pitch track and can be sequenced differently than pitch track 1. Not only that, I can actually change the time division of this track and have it run separately as a multiple of what's going on track 1. It doesn't even have to be the same length as track 1, it can be any length I want. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll keep them the same length. The notes are playing paraphonically, which means they share the envelope and filter, but they can sound completely differently. So that's how you can disconnect tracks 3 and 4 from any relationship to tracks 1 and 2, and they can be pitch or gate tracks, but they can also be radically different modulators. The first and simplest kind of modulator is a voltage range. So you can choose the range. Here it's, let's say 1 volt, and then I can turn the knobs and choose any value within a 1 volt range. And that can be done for each and every one of the steps. Note we're sending voltage, so it will be added to whatever voltage is already sent to this oscillator. There are a few voltage ranges that you can choose from. The higher the range, the farther the steps are from each other, and you can use the secondary shift function to slide between the ranges. The next kind of modulation is where it starts to get really exciting. You can create envelope steps. What this means is that you can have every step in the sequence trigger an attack decay modulation. Shift knob sets the attack duration, add a step to start another envelope, and turn the knob without shift to set the decay. And you can do this for tracks 3 and 4. Now, I don't know about you, this is pretty wild in my book. You get 2 extra envelopes, and this is beyond the envelopes that are on the main board. And as far as track types, it gets even wilder. Each of tracks 3 and 4 can also be independent LFOs. There are 6 LFO types. This is a sine wave LFO. It can be timed independently. Every trigger, every step can change the frequency of the LFO, and you can have it either free running or synced to the tempo. Here I'm syncing it manually by determining the hertz, but you can do it in relation to the speed of the sequence as well. I'm resetting the LFO every first step. In terms of LFO types, you've got triangle, ramping saw, regular or declining saw, square, and random or sample and hold. You can change the LFO midway, so I'll add a step here and change the LFO speed So you could set a different rate for every step in the sequence, any way you wanted. Lastly, the secondary or shift function for the LFOs set the LFO depth. So how deep the voltage changes are as it cycles through the LFO wave. So, with this madness, I'll be covering this instrument in depth and the sequencer in further episodes on this channel. So hit like if you liked it, comment if you have any questions, hit subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.